Hello everybody, my name is Professor Scalar and welcome to a bit of an interesting video today where I'm going to be talking about the good and the bad of Rundown 3. Not GTFO as a whole, just Rundown 3. Mainly I'm going to be comparing it to Rundown 2. You may have noticed if you watched all my other videos, I was doing a lot of comparisons. And I felt like I did a lot more with 3 and 2 than I did with 2 and 1. And while I think it's okay to share similar assets between rundowns and like level designs and mission objectives, I think there's a point where you cross the line of it's too much, and I think some of Rundown 3 crossed that line a bit too much. So I want to talk about it a bit here, because I do see a decent amount of people talking about it everywhere on the internet, and I figured I'd make a 20 to 30 or so minute video just discussing this and what my thoughts were on it. I'm going to try to keep it concise, so I obviously will not be talking about everything. I just have a few specific things I do want to talk about with some examples to back them up. Also, I will be talking about this from the perspective of myself, a veteran player, the perspective of a newer player who probably won't even know what I'm talking about for the most part, and also the developers themselves and probably the ideas or plans they had when they did what they did. I would love to see your perspectives and what you guys think as well, so let me know down in the comments what your thoughts are on this rundown in particular or the game as a whole, and write whatever you want. Do please be civil about it and respect other people, especially if somebody does write a polar opposite review from yours. Don't just attack them for it. If you do, I will delete your comment. Just be respectful of other people. I'm fine with having friendly debates and people discussing what they think were good things, what they think were bad things, and just new cool ideas they have for the future. But with that all out of the way, let's get into this video, starting off with me mainly talking about what I consider the negatives about Rundown 3, followed up by what I consider the positives. Starting off, let's talk about what I mentioned a little bit earlier with similarities. When I compare levels, I like to compare them based off of the objective and just the layout of the levels themselves. And in some cases with Rundown 3, the similarities are a bit too much when it comes to Rundown 2. The 4 levels I really want to talk about are A2, A3, B1, and C1. A2 being the worst of them all. A2, for those who have played Rundown 2, is a copy of R2D1. It's just a much easier basic version of it. And it felt really off because when I play a level, I like to have uniqueness because I don't know what I'm doing if it's unique, and I like something challenging. With the beginning levels, especially A tier and some of the B tier, difficulty isn't really a thing for a more experienced player like myself, especially when I'm playing with an experienced group of players. So it really relies on uniqueness for me to enjoy the level. A2 is the opposite of uniqueness to me. It's the same as D1, a lot of the rooms look the same, the objective is the same, how you play the level is pretty much the exact same. Even the ending is almost the same, just much easier and just not as fun. So to me, A2 just didn't really like it, and I feel like it was a bit of a letdown level in this rundown. As for people who are new to it though, I think it was a great level. I should say with all of these levels I'm about to talk about, for new players who did not play Rundown 2 or didn't play the Rundown 2 counterpart, I think these are good levels and I actually really do enjoy them, which I'll talk about more later. A3 is pretty similar to D2. They're both reactor levels, and while you can argue reactor levels are all pretty much the same or very similar, it was still a similar thing with A3. This one not so much because the level itself was similar, because by no means were they similar. A lot of the rooms were completely new and it was a unique feeling. But I think the reason I wasn't a big fan of it was the fact that from R2D2, a super difficult reactor level, I went down to an R3A3 reactor level, which was super easy. Again, a good level design for newer players and definitely a lot of fun, but it felt really weird doing D2 a lot before this rundown came out, and then doing basically an easy version of D2. Maybe if they made the reactor level in the B tier and made it a bit more difficult, maybe making it so you had to go to the east as well instead of just the north and west, or making it so that the enemies came from the north and west pretty much as soon as you open them, then I feel like this level would have been a bit different and I would have enjoyed it a bit more, even though it would have been even more similar to D2 in that case, if it was just a bit more difficult. B1 was very similar to R2-C1. You're trying to find terminals to triangulate a source or use an uplink, main difference being you have 3 in C1 and 2 in B1. But my biggest issue is the second half. The first half of B1 is beautiful, completely unique style, different type of design for the rooms, and I loved it. It was very nice. However, when you got to the main central room, that all went away and I was pretty upset. The thing about B1 central room is it's the same one in C1. Same central room and the same type of concept level. It just doesn't feel good. The main difference being with C1, it's obviously more difficult and you actually have an uplink terminal in that room, but then you go past that room and you only come back on your way out. Well, B1, you're in that room and you have to go to the north through an alarm door, to the south through the alarm door, and then go west for your extract through a warden door. However, B1 is a bit better because it is a bit challenging. While it may not look like it, it does have some difficulties in it. Overall with that level, you have to do 3 alarm doors, 2 uplink terminals, and you have to do 1 warden door. And then you also have your extract scan you have to do while enemies are trying to kill you. It did bring a challenge to it, and I think it's a little bit better because of that, and I think people treat it maybe a bit too harsh. Because while it is very similar with that final room and the mechanics, it does add in some new challenges that even some new or old professional players may get a little bit caught off guard with, because they might accidentally blow all their tool refill and then have to do an alarm door with practically no tool. And even then, it could be difficult because that warden door is a bit of a pain to deal with. Finally, we have C1. C1 is not a copy of a Rundown 2 level, but actually a copy of the Alpha Rundown level, the very first level that was introduced way back then. Starting off, the objective is the same. It actually is the same in the game, pretty much points out the reason it's called Alpha is because it's meant to be a copy of it. However, C1 is what I think is a perfect example of how this should be treated. First off, C1 was difficult. It was a hard level to beat, which automatically made it better in my opinion, but also had unique stuff. While the rooms looked almost the same between them two, there were a lot of different paths. There were more objectives you had to do, more key cards, more paths you had to go to, more alarm doors, more security doors, new enemies, the chargers, the error alarm. They added a ton of new stuff between them that really made it feel like it was different. Even though I felt like, yeah, I know this room, I've been in this room quite a bit when I did the Alpha rundown, I felt like, man, this is so much different. In some ways, it actually screwed me over a little bit because I was thinking, okay, yeah, I know this part. I walk in the room, it's like, oh god, no, I don't know this part, back up. And it was nice. Infectious fog was another major thing. That was in there, wasn't in the Alpha rundown. It changed up a lot, and this is how I think levels like this should be treated with in the future. If you make them similar, then that's okay. For example, if Rundown 4 had, let's say, R4D2 and it was another type of air filtration level, I'd be okay with it for the most part. As long as they made the levels and zones you had to go through very unique and very challenging, I'd be okay with it. Sure, it's another purification type level, but it's more difficult and there's a new twist added to it which makes it a new experience. C to E levels in Rundown 2 should not have been the ones that built the building blocks of the A to B levels in Rundown 3. Because then you're taking super difficult levels and making them much easier, which one takes out the uniqueness and takes out the difficulty, which then leaves veteran players not really having anything they can cling on to saying, yeah, I like it because of this. So if they treat it more like C1 Alpha, then I think that would be better, and that's what I'm hoping to see in the future when they do levels like this. Another thing that people talk about quite a bit when it comes to Rundown 3 is how much easier it feels. This though is where we really need to take perspective into consideration. As a veteran player myself, I say yes, this rundown felt super easy. I beat every level on my first try except for C1, which only took me 3, and then D1, which granted took me almost 10 hours to beat, But even then, 5 out of 7 levels were super easy, and the C one I would consider moderate. D was the only one I considered hard. While in Rundown 2, I failed multiple times on B1, even after the nerf, and B2 and B3 were also pretty hard. D1 and D2 and E1 were nightmare fuel for me, but still very fun. But for perspectives of newer players, these are actually fairly difficult levels. A1 does a good job of introducing stuff, but A2 definitely brings in the challenge of a bunch of big enemies you have to deal with. And then you have to deal with infectious fog, you have to deal with scouts, you have to go with blood doors, which are hybrids and stuff you've never seen. New challenge. A3, definitely a difficult challenge for people who don't know how to properly set up for tower defense stuff like this when it's a reactor level, or quickly going through zones and making sure you get the code and get back fast enough. And also, resource management is a big thing of A3, and this is definitely a challenging thing for newer players. So difficulty wise, while I do agree the entire Rundown as a whole is easier than Rundown 2, speaking of it from a neutral ground, not experienced or non-experienced, I don't think it's necessarily in a bad difficulty section. I think a lot of the negative comments when it comes to this are from people who are so used to E1, D1 difficulties and then dealing with 5 or 6 levels that are definitely much easier, and then a 7th level which is not as difficult but still up there, and that's the main issue. I think that the developers really wanted to make some beginner introduction levels that really honed in the basics to people and really get them understanding how the game worked. And while I don't think that's bad, I don't think 3 beginner levels is a good idea. I think at the most you should ever have A2, never A3, because then you're putting too many levels on the easy side of stuff where veteran players just don't have as much fun with it. And even then, newer players, while I might teach them the basics, they might not have as fun with it too because of how easy they could be. I feel like with Rundown 2 or Rundown 3, if they added in another C or D level, it would be a different situation for people. The veterans just want more difficult stuff, and we didn't really get it. Hopefully in future rundowns, either give us more difficult levels, I'd say at least make almost 50% of a rundown at least C tier or higher, or just make it so that the earlier levels are really unique and have either replay ability or they're completely different types of levels that we haven't dealt with before. That way, even though they're easier, it's definitely good. But please don't make an entire rundown easier just to satisfy people who want the game to be easier. You made this game to be difficult, and I pray you don't lose sight of that and you don't turn this into an easy game to satisfy those people. Make it difficult and give veterans this challenge they are looking for. And finally, the last thing I want to talk about before going to the positives of Rundown 3 is lack of choices in levels and risk and reward. There wasn't too much of it in Rundown 3, and it's something that I really enjoy in levels because it makes me want to replay them. The replay value is something that I value in GTFO because obviously once I finish the last rundown, what do I do until the next one? I keep playing levels over again and helping people out. But is it really that fun if I'm just doing the same thing over and over and over again? No, it really isn't. Compared to Rundown 2, I'm having a very difficult time to actually play the Rundown 3 levels over again. I do have fun playing them and I do enjoy them, but there's just very little replay value in them. I would talk about all of this, you know, go into details about all the levels from each rundown, but every time I've done that to this point while making this recording has taken quite a few minutes. So instead, poof, here you go, on screen, you can see them all right there. All of the Rundown 2 and all the Rundown 3 levels with brief and explanations of where the replay value really rested in. As you can see, with Rundown 2 and Rundown 3, there's quite a difference. With the Rundown 2 levels, some of them are very simple, like with A1, it's literally just one of 2 different zones you go to get your first cargo, and there's really nothing too much different. But then stuff like D1, there's so much difference to it. That honestly is probably going to be quite a bit longer than the other ones with this explanation, but there's just so much more you could do. So many different pathways you can take, so many different ways you could handle a level or how you'd have to prepare for stuff. It was very different almost every time I played the level, and it was always a lot of fun to replay them. But with Rundown 3, you can see that's just not the case. Some of these have literally nothing written down because that's just the truth. There is no alternate way. You could maybe do the objective slightly differently, like B1, you could do the order of the terminals and the warden door differently, but at the end of the day, you're still doing the same thing. You're going into both zones, clearing out the enemies, doing the terminal, opening up the warden door before you do the second terminal. It's the same. There's no difference in them. C1 is, in my opinion, really the only level in Rundown 3 that really shines, because there's the keycard zone right off the bat, which you could go back into the other one if you want to collect even more resources, because it's just a security scan, so you don't lose anything getting into it. However, you may lose stuff wandering through if you set off enemies or the scout. You had that resource room that was very risky and very dangerous to go through, but you got a lot of resources out or from it if you did do it. And then the best part is the HSU route, 3 zones you have to go through, but there are 3 sets of zones you had to go through. So you could go down one route and the next run go down the other route, and the last half of the level feels completely different. Much more satisfying. But that's really the only one. The other levels have a few examples, but that's really it. So I'm hoping that in future rundowns, GTFO, or 10 Chambers I should say, really does change this. I love to see levels with replay value, and I think having alternate routes like C1 and like D1 and stuff, I think those are really good ways of handling it, and I'm hoping to see that again. But let me know what you think about it. Do you guys enjoy the clean cut levels, or do you enjoy having variety and replay value? Now let's talk about the good things, just the things I really enjoyed in Rundown 3 and I hope to see more of in the future. Starting off with the Birther. My god, I love this enemy. It's not my favorite enemy, but I love the potential it brings for future enemies in the game. Almost every enemy up to this point has been a simple melee it and kill it stealthily, or just shoot it in the head or the back if you have to go loud. But this enemy is so much different. You have to shoot it in its weak spots. If you shoot it anywhere else, it does very insignificant damage. You can't really melee this thing, and while you can easily kill its stealth, its attack's really cool too. It doesn't just shoot you from afar or run up to you and lick you or punch you. No, this thing spawns in a bunch of tiny babies which lick you. Granted, they do lick you, but then it runs from you, and if you get too close, spawns in a giant smoke cloud that practically blinds you and then tries to get away from you until it can birth more enemies. Very nice, and I love it. I've always joked, or not so much joked, but like the idea of when it comes to the warden doors, how it opens at the top and you can see through that slot in the middle, and then it stops for a few seconds until the door fully opens all the way. I always thought it'd be a really cool thing if they made sort of a boss enemy that you open up a warden door, and when it does that animation, instead of it continuing like normal, a enemy reaches through with like a tentacle or an arm and like grabs the door and starts bending the metal and then pries the whole thing off the hinges and just throws it across the room. I always thought that no, that's not gonna happen. 10 Chambers wouldn't do that. Now I think they will. I think something like that is possible if they're willing to do stuff like mini bosses and actual boss fights with sort of epic battle rooms. I think that idea is actually possible, and oh my gosh, 10 Chambers, please do that. I'm sure most, if not all, the community would love to see something like that, because that would be very cool. It just goes to show there's potential for cooler enemies. Maybe not something like that drastic, but enemies that you don't simply just melee or shoot wherever you want in the head and try to kill. Maybe they'll make enemies that you have to be a bit more strategic with if you want to kill it. Then there's the introduction of lore. I love lore in video games, and GTFO is no exception. I was a bit nervous though when they were saying they were adding in lore, because I thought it would be purely a terminal thing where you would just open the terminal and you find a log and that's it. And while that is the case for most of it, they did it through the environment as well, and that's what I love to see. The enemies you see in the containers have been studied, the plants everywhere, the stuff that looks like birther sacs and test chambers, the weird organisms that are crawling across the floor that might be moss or might be something else. And then all the monitors that have iridium on them, like all that, it shows that there's lore, but you have to dig for it. You don't get to just see that treasure chest up on the surface. You have to go dig in and find that thing, and then there's still a lock on that treasure chest that you need to find the very complicated combination to open. I'm happy for it, and I'm really hoping that 10 Chambers continues with that style and doesn't just straight up throw lore in our face, and rather make us work for it while still throwing a little bit of it in our faces. The other thing is, while I said this rundown did feel pretty easy compared to Rundown 2, I still feel like the final few levels were a challenge. And this is coming from the perspective of somebody who was a veteran, but I'm also speaking through the perspective of a newer player. These are definitely difficult levels. B1, having to manage all your resources quite well and making sure you don't use up too much too soon, is definitely a difficult thing. B2, having to go through areas holding a fog turbine, a bunch of spitters everywhere, the birther fight you have to do, a blood door that's also an alarm door, tons of enemies, scouts in the fog. Very nice touches, and I like what they did with it. It definitely makes it challenging for a B level. C is also a pretty good challenging level too. A good positioning of enemies, a good amount of scouts in them, putting scouts in rooms next to each other, so if you set off one you might set off the other. Adding in high value resource rooms are difficult to get into, but in some situations might be almost necessary for you to beat the level. An error alarm, that's always a nice way to add difficulty, is just adding in the error alarm. The charger being reintroduced, all of that made C1 a difficult level, and I feel like it belongs in the C category. It definitely lives up to its name. And then D1 truly felt like a very difficult level. It felt like a finale level. It's not E1 difficulty from Rundown 2 by any means, but it is difficult. Your error alarm being right at the beginning of the level, which I like because error alarms, in my opinion, are a little bit RNG based, because if you don't want enemies to spawn in front of you and they do, sometimes that could screw you over. I'm looking at you, E1, towards the very end when the enemy spawned in the final room with the scout in it. I'm still slightly irked by that if you could not tell. But it was nice to have the error alarm at the beginning and then no alarm for the last half, but still making the last half hard where you have to manage your resources, you have to be careful of scouts, sleeping hybrids, all that. It was very nice, and I think that these levels definitely do a good job for difficulty. And if I say that, you might wonder, why do I still say it's so easy? Well, also keep in mind, I consider B and A easy, C and D I consider difficult, and E I consider nightmarish. We had 2 C's, 2 D's, and an E in Rundown 2, and only 1 C, 1 D here. So yes, it did have difficult levels, but the rundown as a whole was more on the easier side. And then another thing I want to talk about as well is sort of difficulty outside of a ton of enemies. This is something I was afraid of when I started playing this game for the first time, was that harder levels would just be rooms with like 50 enemies and maybe a scout, that's it. And basically rooms that if you set them off, you're pretty much guaranteed to fail if you don't know what you're doing. And I'm glad to see that that has not been the way this game has progressed. The difficult levels adding in new stuff, surge alarm from Rundown 2, we have the error alarms, we have new enemies like the charge or the birther, the queen birther. Levels that make you think before putting your resources into turrets and stuff or mines, making you conserve your resources a little bit and be careful with it. I like it. And while there are definitely rooms with a ton of enemies, and maybe some rooms with a lot of difficult enemies, it's nice to see that that isn't just the route they're taking. Also, hybrids, sleeping hybrids. That was something I wondered if we'd ever get. Back in E1, it was a rare occurrence you'd find them in that fog zone, but I wondered if we'd ever get it again, and I'm glad to see we do. Sleeping hybrids are difficult to deal with because they require 4 fully charged melee hits to the back, and if somebody hits the arm or the legs, it doesn't count. But it definitely was a nice feeling because it also shows that they're willing to take enemies that we might not always expect to see sleeping around and add them in. Honestly, I would not be surprised in Rundown 4 to have sort of an average sized room with a bunch of sleeping enemies, and then boom, we have another sleeping birther in the middle. Or maybe shadows. We didn't have shadows in Rundown 3, and in Rundown 2 and 1, we only found shadows awake during alarms. not including the big shadows that did appear in E1. But who knows, maybe we'll get levels with sleeping shadows, which definitely adds in a interesting mechanic because one, blocking line of sight might not be as simple as we think it is because we don't technically know where they're looking, and without a bio tracker we don't exactly know who's within detection radius of who, and it's a bit more difficult. That would definitely add challenge. A room with 5 sleeping shadows in it, to deal with it stealthily anyway, would be more difficult than probably a room with 20 regular enemies. Granted though, you'd probably just go loud with the shadows anyway, but I do like to see that they're not just simply adding more and more and more enemies, and that's not the route they're going to take to make the game more difficult. So good on you, 10 Chambers, please do keep it up. And finally, the last thing I want to talk about is the Charger reintroduction. This was beautifully well done. When it comes to new enemies, I'm sometimes disappointed by the fact that I don't really, I guess it's sort of a lackluster introduction. I'll use the hybrid as an example. The first time seeing a hybrid was behind a blood door on R2B2. Or sorry, no, R2B1 was when they appeared. And I won't lie, I did not recognize them the first time I did it. The first time I did that level, I did not realize what a hybrid was. I didn't even realize the thing existed until one of my later runs, and I finally noticed, oh yeah, that's a hybrid. Whoa, what is this enemy? It didn't really feel like it had a proper introduction to me. It was introduced behind a blood door, yes, but the Charger, it was a very nice introduction. That high-pitched, just screech that sent a chill down your spine. Seeing pitch black enemies in a dark room with a giant black blob in the ceiling that you have no idea what you're doing with. For veteran players who knew what we were doing, it was still cool. Heck, my entire group that I played that one on with the video that you guys might have seen, we had all seen Chargers before. We knew what they were, except for one of us, I think. And yet every single one of us had a chill go down our spine when we heard that sound. It scared us, and I love it, and I hope more enemies had that. Same thing with the Birther, having a giant wide open arena room that basically tells you, hey, this might be boss fight time. I think that was well done. It wasn't done by sound, but it was done by level design with having all the sacks everywhere and then the big open arena room. I'm glad that's how they reintroduced them, and also Chargers got slightly reworked. They look a little bit different, a bit more polished, and they sound different. And I'm hoping that not only will future enemies that come to the game look like this and have stuff like that happen to them, I also hope that maybe some older enemies will undergo polishing, maybe slightly reworking them. I think most of the enemies are pretty balanced for what they are, but it would be really cool if maybe in future rundowns, the strikers and the shooters would get a little bit of a visual effect update, make them look a little bit different, maybe make the projectile look better or the tongue attack better. By no means do I think they have to be improved, but it could look pretty cool if future or previous enemies we've seen before get visual updates in the future. And that's everything. I easily could go on for probably another hour or so, but I don't think anybody wants to hear me talk about my opinions on this game for about an hour, so I'll leave it there. If you do want more opinions from me though, or if you have questions or anything like that, or you want feedback on an opinion of your own, then write it down in the comment and I'll gladly take time out of my day to go take a look at it and write a comment in response. I would love to see people's opinions about this game. I love getting people's perspectives, especially some of the more negative ones from time to time, just because it's one thing to get nothing but positive responses of the game, but it's good to see where people who don't like the game, where they're coming from in the first place. Just be respectful of other people. If somebody does write a comment down below explaining why they think the game is bad, don't attack them saying they're stupid or anything like that. If you do, I will delete your comment. Just please be respectful of other people. I want this to be a respectful community I'm building here on YouTube, so please make my life a little bit easier. The last thing I will mention before I end off this video is I will have 2 links in the description to a Twitter account that is not my own. This is the Warden GTFO Twitter account. The main reason I'm putting these there is because another thing I did want to briefly talk about, but I decided not to, is the player count of these rundowns. You can see how many people, or not people, but how many prisoners were dispatched on every single level and the rundown as a whole, and how many of them actually survived and succeeded. and I think it's actually pretty interesting information. It also goes and shows you how much the player count has dropped, and this could be a potential reason why Rundown 3 had a lot more beginner levels than the previous rundowns. But again, that's my speculation. I don't think there's anything wrong with 10 Chambers focusing a little bit more on newer players and making sure that they stick around and continue playing the game. But I also don't think it's an excuse to make the entire rundown easier and make only 1 or 2 super difficult levels for veterans because of it. You know, again, this is going back to all the points I had mentioned earlier in the video, but just some information, just some food for thought for you guys. But that's everything. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, leave a like, write a comment, subscribe to the channel, ring that bell notification, follow me on Twitter, all that good stuff that every YouTuber tells you to do at the beginning or end of every single video. You get the point. I hope you're all having a wonderful day, and I'll see you all in the next video, which is going to be a little bit different. I hope you guys enjoy challenge videos, because the next one is going to be quite challenging indeed.